Welcome to our channel, where true honor meets unforgettable stories. If you love tales that challenge perceptions and reveal unexpected truths, you're in the right place. As we dive into today's powerful story, we want to know, where in the world are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button because tomorrow at this very same time, we'll be sharing another incredible Royal Guard story that you won't want to miss. Ready? Let's begin our journey into a tale that will leave you thinking long after it ends. A Royal Guard took a logic test. The final answer left the professor speechless. The morning sun filtered softly through the towering buildings of central London, casting long golden streaks across the windows of Westfield Academy. Inside a modest two-story home just a few blocks away, Captain Jonathan Hale, a 44-year-old veteran of the British Army and current ceremonial guardsman at Buckingham Palace, was meticulously pressing the creases of his scarlet tunic. His movements were precise, sharp, practiced, and almost meditative. 2 decades of service had taught him that discipline didn't end on the battlefield. It extended into the smallest routines. How you dressed, how you stood, even how you breathed when others were watching. He glanced up at the clock. 7:35 a.m. "Ethan," he called, his voice calm yet firm. "Are you up, son? You've got school." A muffled groan drifted down the staircase, followed by slow, unmotivated footsteps. Ethan Hale, barely 14 and firmly in the middle of that stage where everything his father represented felt ancient, appeared at the bottom of the stairs still in pajama pants and an oversized hoodie. His hair was a mess, his face pure reluctance. "I don't feel great," he mumbled. "Think I've got a fever." Jonathan didn't react with skepticism or annoyance. Instead, he walked over, placed the back of his hand gently against his son's forehead, and nodded thoughtfully. "No fever detected, Lieutenant," he said, using the old nickname that once brought smiles. This morning, however, it only drew a half-hearted shrug from the boy. "Dad," Ethan said, avoiding eye contact, "I really don't want to go today. Just one day off, please?" Jonathan didn't answer right away. He returned to the table, picked up his white gloves, and sat down, motioning for Ethan to do the same. "School's not optional, son," he said quietly. "Education is the foundation for everything, even for me, even for a soldier." Ethan sighed and looked down at the toast he hadn't touched. "Yeah, but Professor Whitmore says traditions like the Royal Guard are outdated, that they're just for show." Ah, so that was it. Jonathan had heard of Professor Graham Whitmore, a brilliant but controversial academic, known for his disdain toward the monarchy and any form of military ceremony. Jonathan wasn't surprised his son had absorbed that perspective. In truth, he welcomed open thinking. What he didn't welcome was dismissal without understanding. "All the more reason to go," Jonathan said as he stood and adjusted the golden buttons of his tunic. "If you're going to challenge ideas, you should do it from a place of understanding, not ignorance." Ethan looked up, alarmed. "Wait, you're not coming in that, are you?" Jonathan didn't reply. He simply gave him a look, a quiet, unmistakable yes. The drive to school was quiet. London traffic crawled, but the silence between father and son stretched longer. Finally, Jonathan spoke. "So, this Professor Whitmore, he doesn't think we have value?" Ethan fidgeted in his seat. "He says people join the military because they don't have the grades for university. Yesterday, he asked if I was gonna follow in Dad's footsteps and become a mindless mannequin in red." Jonathan's knuckles whitened slightly on the steering wheel, but his tone remained even. "I see." He pulled up to the front of Westfield Academy, where luxury cars dropped off crisply dressed students. Many turned to stare at the man in the full ceremonial uniform of the Queen's Guard, stepping out of a modest vehicle. "Let's go," Jonathan said, stepping into full posture. "Dad, no, he'll humiliate you," Ethan whispered. Jonathan glanced at his son. "Only if I let him." And with that, they walked toward the building together, one in full regalia, the other in school uniform, each about to learn that real tradition isn't fragile. It doesn't crumble under scrutiny. It responds with quiet strength. The hallways of Westfield Academy buzzed with morning chatter as students shuffled to their classrooms. But the buzz softened to hushed murmurs the moment Captain Jonathan Hale stepped through the main entrance in full ceremonial uniform, scarlet tunic gleaming, black boots polished to mirror shine, and his signature bearskin cap tucked under one arm. The school had seen visiting parents before, but never like this. At his side, Ethan walked stiffly, trying not to meet anyone's gaze. His face burned redder than his father's uniform. Every student they passed seemed to pause, some whispering, others outright staring. This wasn't just a dad dropping off his kid. It was a man walking straight into enemy territory. "Dad, please," Ethan whispered. "You don't have to go in. Just let me handle it." Jonathan didn't break stride. "Ethan," he said calmly, "if someone questions our values, you don't run from it. You show up, respectfully, steadily, the way a guard does." They reached the classroom door just as the bell rang. Through the narrow window, Professor Graham Whitmore was already in full lecture mode. His tweed jacket was immaculate, his voice clear, crisp, and slicing through the air like a scalpel. He was speaking about modern British identity, and his timing, perhaps fate, couldn't have been more perfect. Jonathan pushed open the door. "Ah," Whitmore said, arching an eyebrow. Mid-sentence, "Mr. Hale, so gracious of you to join us, and with an escort no less." His eyes scanned Jonathan's uniform, and a smirk curled at the edges of his mouth. How appropriate, a living prop for our discussion on outdated institutions. Ethan froze. A few students chuckled awkwardly. Others looked mortified. Jonathan stepped forward, unshaken. "Apologies for the disruption, Professor," he said, voice firm yet respectful. "I just wanted to ensure my son arrived safely." "Of course," Whitmore replied, his tone razor-sharp. "And what an entrance. Class, please take note. We're in the presence of a true symbol of Her Majesty's Britain. Tell me, Captain, do you prefer to be called that? Or perhaps living statue fits better?" Jonathan didn't flinch. "Captain Hale is fine. And while we do remain still, Professor, we're trained to move when necessary." The room fell silent. Even the back row students, usually half asleep by now, leaned forward. Whitmore wasn't done. "You know, since you're already here," he said, pacing toward the front of the room, "why not take part in a little exercise? I often challenge my students to question the real world. Application of tradition. Today, perhaps you can help answer the question yourself. What intellectual value is there in standing still for hours?" Ethan's stomach sank. His worst fear was playing out in real time. Jonathan glanced at him, then turned to the class. "I'd be honored," he said, "if it might teach something." Whitmore's eyes glittered with condescension. "Splendid. Let's see what the Crown's finest can do when faced with something more abstract." He reached into his desk and pulled out a folder. "Here's a cognitive reasoning assessment I use for students in advanced coursework. Logic puzzles, pattern recognition, lateral thinking problems. Please, indulge us." Jonathan took the packet without hesitation, walking to an empty desk at the side. He set his bearskin cap down, unbuttoned his gloves, and picked up a pencil. The classroom held its breath. "Now," Whitmore added with a smile, "don't worry about speed, though I'll be timing just for fun." Jonathan said nothing. He simply began. Each movement was controlled, each mark on the page made with intention. He wasn't just solving puzzles, he was executing strategy. With every problem he worked through, the tension in the room shifted. The performance Whitmore had hoped would humiliate him was turning into something else entirely. And Ethan? He sat straighter in his chair. For the first time all semester, he wasn't trying to hide. He was watching his father fight back, with nothing but a pencil, silence, and the kind of discipline no classroom could teach. The room had gone still. "You could hear the faint ticking of the wall clock above the whiteboard, the scratch of a few pencils from curious students who dared to attempt the test alongside Captain Jonathan Hale, and the subtle creak of Professor Whitmore's loafers as he circled the classroom like a hawk. Jonathan didn't rush. He didn't need to. He approached each problem the same way he approached a mission briefing, reading the scenario, identifying patterns, isolating variables. His hand moved steadily, deliberately. This wasn't guesswork. This was calculation. Strategy, precision. Interesting, Whitmore muttered loud enough for the class to hear. He's working through the problem sequentially, not scanning for the easiest first. Very linear, very military. A few students exchanged glances. A girl in the front row paused mid-problem and tilted her head. She wasn't sure whether the professor was being insightful or just condescending. At his desk, Ethan sat frozen, barely breathing. His eyes flicked from his father's pencil to the professor's smug grin. The tension in the room felt like a live wire. At any moment, it could spark. Professor Whitmore leaned in behind Jonathan. "Careful on this next section," he said with a smirk. "Most students with strong analytical skills get tripped up here. It requires lateral thinking, breaking away from rigid frameworks." Jonathan didn't answer. He kept writing. Whitmore turned back to the class. "You see, students, when people are trained to follow orders, they often struggle when given freedom. The absence of structure exposes the limits of conditioned thought." Another jab, subtle, dressed in academic vocabulary but still a jab. And yet, Jonathan remained calm. He flipped to the next page. His expression never changed. But a few sharp-eyed students noticed something Professor Whitmore didn't. The answers were adding up. One student near the back actually stopped his own test to compare, only to blink in disbelief. Jonathan's solutions weren't just correct. They were fast and surprisingly elegant. 10 minutes passed. Then 12. Professor Whitmore's confidence began to falter. The circling stopped. The smug commentary faded. He hovered behind his desk now, fingers tapping an uneven beat on the wood. "You know, Captain," he said, forcing a casual tone. "There's no shame in skipping ahead. Most people don't finish the whole test." Jonathan didn't even look up. "I prefer to be thorough," he said simply, his pencil still gliding over the paper. A girl in the second row smiled. She wasn't laughing at him. She was rooting for him. And for the first time, so was Ethan. The final section came into view, the hardest set. The one Whitmore once bragged had stumped 2 PhD candidates from Oxford. A maze of variables, abstract logic twists, and scenarios that rewarded creativity over calculation. Jonathan paused, not out of hesitation, but evaluation. Then slowly, methodically, he began again. He approached the final problem like a field commander mapping a battlefield. Not as a riddle to decode, but a real-world operation. Resource allocation under pressure. He visualized constraints like enemy positions, saw variables as moving parts in a live environment. It wasn't just numbers, it was chess, war games, intelligence planning. It was familiar terrain. At minute 15, he set his pencil down. Finished. Silence swallowed the room. Professor Whitmore, caught mid-step, blinked. "You're done?" "Yes," Jonathan said, standing. He aligned the pages neat as a dossier and offered them forward with one white-gloved hand. "Would you like to review my work?" For the first time that morning, Whitmore didn't have a ready line. He took the pages with a forced smile and began scanning. The smile vanished by page 2. His brow furrowed by page 3. By the time he reached the final answer, he stopped completely. Jonathan hadn't just solved it, he'd reframed it. "You approached this like a tactical scenario," the professor murmured. Jonathan gave a small nod. "Because that's what was." The students leaned forward, captivated. The man they were told was a mannequin in red had just outmaneuvered their top academic on his own battlefield. And for the first time, Ethan Hale's chest rose with pride. "Professor Graham." Whitmore stared at the final page as though it had betrayed him. He flipped back and forth between Jonathan Hale's diagrams, his calculations, and the annotated logic trees the soldier had drawn in the margins. They weren't just answers. They were strategic breakdowns, simplified, structured, and cross-referenced. It was the kind of clarity Whitmore hadn't expected, the kind that challenged the very foundation of his assumptions. A long silence hung in the air. Then a voice cut through it. "Professor?" a girl in the second row asked, her voice hesitant, but steady. "His last answers, it works. I checked it against mine." Whitmore blinked, caught off guard. "Yes, well," he stammered, his usual polished cadence now fraying at the edges. "It's certainly unconventional." Jonathan's voice, calm but commanding, followed quickly. "Is it incorrect?" Whitmore paused. He hated the moment, hated the position he'd placed himself in. But the truth was undeniable. "No," he admitted. "It's not incorrect, just not the method I teach." Jonathan nodded, respectful but firm. In asymmetric warfare, we rarely have the luxury of perfect information. We learn to improvise, adapt, reframe problems. That last puzzle wasn't just a logic problem. It was a tactical simulation. Resource allocation under pressure. He stepped toward the whiteboard. "May I?" Whitmore hesitated, then stepped aside, clearly shaken. Jonathan picked up the marker. With steady movements, he redrew the final problem on the board, then walked the class through his thought process. How he had grouped unknowns, assigned dynamic values, and mapped multiple solution paths. The soldier's gloved hand moved with precision, turning abstract math into battlefield maneuvering. What had once felt academic now felt real. "By approaching it as a command scenario," Jonathan continued, "I used a strategy we apply in the field, dividing objectives into primary and secondary targets, adapting the plan as new intelligence comes in." Students leaned in, wide-eyed. A boy in the back row whispered to a friend, "This is actually genius." Ethan sat frozen, heart pounding. He wasn't just watching his dad explain math. He was watching him command a room, without shouting, without arrogance, just through quiet, earned authority. Professor Whitmore's posture stiffened. He wasn't used to losing control in his own domain. "You speak well, Captain. But standing, still at Buckingham Palace, how does that serve any intellectual purpose? What value does that bring to modern society?" Jonathan didn't hesitate. "Standing still isn't about mindless obedience," he said, turning back to face the class. "It's about control, presence, mental focus under pressure, the ability to remain alert and ready, even when nothing is happening. It's the physical embodiment of discipline and trust." He let the words settle before continuing. "Before I stood at Buckingham Palace, I served 3 tours in Iraq. I lost people under my command. I wrote strategic assessments adopted by NATO for urban threat response. I earned a master's in military history from King's College London, and another in international security from St. Andrews." The class was silent. Even Whitmore said nothing. "I'm not here to argue academia doesn't matter," Jonathan said. "It does, deeply. But it's not the only form of intelligence. Knowledge comes from many paths, some shaped in libraries, others forged under fire. We need both." He looked to Ethan. The boy's eyes met his father's, and for the first time in months they were filled with pride, not conflict. "You challenged me to show intellectual value in what I do, Professor," Jonathan concluded. "But maybe the better question is, can we recognize intelligence when it doesn't look like ours?" He stepped away from the board, collected his cap, and stood tall. "If you'll excuse me, I'm due at my post." As he walked toward the door, the students didn't look away. They watched, not the uniform, but the man inside it. And for the first time all semester, Professor Whitmore was silent. The heavy door clicked shut behind Captain Jonathan Hale, and for a moment, the classroom remained frozen in place. No one moved. No one whispered. They weren't watching a uniform walk out. They were still absorbing the man who had stood in it. Professor Whitmore stood rigid at the front of the room, one hand still resting on the desk as if needing the support. His eyes remained fixed on the whiteboard, where Jonathan's diagram of battlefield-inspired logic still dominated the space once reserved for his lesson. Slowly, the silence cracked. "Professor," said Amira, the same student who'd defended Jonathan's solution, her voice soft but sure. "Can we leave his diagram up? I think it might help with next week's modeling project." Whitmore blinked, then nodded, slowly, cautiously, as if the gesture carried more weight than it should. Yes, that might not be a bad idea." Around the room, students began murmuring quietly, not with the usual casualness of a class winding down, but with genuine interest, discussing the diagrams, revisiting the logic problems, comparing methods. The classroom felt alive in a way it hadn't all semester. Whitmore glanced toward Ethan, who was calmly gathering his books. The boy looked different now. Taller somehow. Not physically, but in presence, in confidence. "Ethan," Whitmore called, his tone more careful than before. "Your father, has he ever published his strategic models?" Ethan looked up, his voice clear. "Yes, sir. A few. One of them, his asymmetrical response framework, was actually adopted by NATO 3 years ago." The professor absorbed that. Information like a man being forced to redraw his own map of the world. "I see," he muttered. "Perhaps we should consider inviting him back for a proper guest lecture." Ethan allowed himself the faintest smile. "I think he'd say yes." Outside, beneath the cool gray London sky, Jonathan Hale resumed his post at Buckingham Palace. To the tourists walking by, cameras in hand, he looked no different than the guards beside him. Motionless, stern, a figure of ceremonial tradition. But for those who had seen him that morning, those who had witnessed what he'd carried beneath the stillness, it was no longer just pageantry. It was power. It was earned. Back in the classroom, Whitmore walked slowly to the board, studying the diagram again. "You know," he said to no one in particular, "I've spent my entire career challenging institutions, questioning traditions, but I never considered—" He trailed off. A student finished the thought for him. That tradition might be smarter than it looks. That afternoon, as students filed out for their next class, the room buzzed not with gossip or complaints, but with thought. Real thought, curiosity, and maybe, just maybe, respect. Ethan stayed behind for a moment, looking once more at the board. The tactical map, the breakdowns, the solution written not in formulas, but in clarity. He smiled. He had always loved his dad. But today, for the first time, he understood him. Later that evening, over dinner, Jonathan said little. He never asked what happened after he left the classroom. He didn't need to, and Ethan didn't explain it. He just sat across from his father, watching him butter a piece of bread with the same steady hand that had silenced an entire classroom. The same hand that had taught him what real strength looked like. Not loud, not angry, not forceful, just unshakable. That night, before bed, Ethan opened his laptop and searched. Queen's Guard duties explained. And the next morning, for the first time all year, he walked into Professor Whitmore's class not with dread, but with pride. "We'd love to hear your thoughts on today's story. Do you believe intelligence should be measured only by academic achievement? Or do you think, like Captain Hale proved, that wisdom, discipline, and real-world experience are just as valuable, sometimes even more? Have you ever judged someone by their profession or uniform, only to discover there was so much more beneath the surface?" Stories like this remind us that the strongest minds don't always speak the loudest, and true leadership often looks quieter than we expect. So tell us, where are you watching from? And what part of the story hit home for you the most? Was it Ethan's journey from doubt to pride? Or the moment Jonathan reframed a logic test as a battlefield strategy? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one, and your perspective might just be the spark for our next story. And if you've ever been underestimated or misjudged, share that too. We want to hear your voice. Let's make this more than just a video. Let's make it a conversation.